He bought an abandoned house for only $500 and thought he had found a place of peace and quiet. But when he opened the door, he froze. Inside, a sheepdog with little puppies was waiting for him. Subscribe to the channel, write in the comments where you are watching from, and be sure to share this video with your friends. The road that led out of town seemed endless, a ribbon of cracked asphalt that curved through fields gone wild with weeds and clusters of pine trees leaning under the weight of years. For Marcus Hale, the road was not just a path toward a destination. It was a severing line between everything that had been and everything he hoped could still be. He had been a soldier for most of his adult life, a man who had carried the weight of duty across deserts, mountains, and foreign cities, always under orders, always with someone else deciding what he should do. And yet, when the war ended for him, the quiet had felt far more brutal than the explosions and gunfire he had once endured. Silence pressed harder than chaos. Loneliness echoed louder than any battlefield. He had spent too many nights in rented apartments where the walls were thin and the shadows in the corners were filled with memories he could not banish. He had thought about leaving the city dozens of times, about disappearing into some forgotten place where no one knew his name, where no one expected him to explain the lines on his face or the heaviness in his eyes. When he saw the listing for the property on the edge of a town he barely remembered passing through once during training years ago, it had seemed more like a dare than an offer. A house for $500. It sounded like a bad joke or the first line of a cautionary tale. But the price was real, the paperwork solid, and for Marcus, the absurdity was exactly what he needed. A man with nothing to lose could afford to gamble on a ruin. The truck he drove rattled with every bump in the broken road, its engine coughing as if it too resented the climb toward something forgotten. The October air was damp, carrying the earthy smell of pine needles and wet soil. A mist hung low over the ground, clinging to the fields and wrapping the edges of the trees in a ghostly shroud. Marcus kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh, fingers twitching unconsciously as they sometimes did when he felt the weight of old habits pressing down. He reminded himself he wasn't scanning rooftops anymore, wasn't checking the shadows for movement. The only thing waiting ahead was an old house with sagging walls. When he reached the rusted iron gate, the place revealed itself like something from a faded photograph. The siding was weather-beaten to the point of looking skeletal. Gray planks stripped bare of paint, nailed together more out of stubbornness than strength. The roof sloped with patches missing. The porch leaned forward as if it had grown tired of standing. The yard was nothing but tangled weeds, some so tall they brushed against the lower windows. The air smelled of damp wood, mold, and something sour, like the residue of too many seasons of rain. For a moment, Marcus simply sat in the truck, staring. He had expected a ruin, but what he saw felt more like a challenge. He killed the engine and stepped out. His boots sank slightly in the wet soil, leaving behind imprints that would likely be swallowed by the next rain. He stretched his back, muscles stiff from the long drive, and let the silence close in around him. The absence of sound here was different from the city silence, which was never truly quiet but filled with the hum of distant traffic or the echo of voices through walls. Here the silence was vast, almost alive, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind moving through the pines. It pressed against him, testing his resolve. The porch groaned under his weight as he climbed the sagging steps, and the wood flexed as though warning him it might not hold much longer. The front door was heavy, its paint peeled away, until the surface was little more than a patchwork of splinters and rusted iron. He turned the knob, half expecting it to resist, but it gave way easily, swinging inward with a long, tired creak. The air that spilled out from inside was thick with dust, carrying the musty scent of neglect. He stepped into the main room and stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through dirt-streaked windows. The house was empty in the way abandoned places are. Empty rooms, stripped of furniture, but not of memory. A layer of dust blanketed the floorboards, and cobwebs stretched across the corners like delicate threads of history. The wallpaper, what little remained of it, peeled in curling strips, revealing plaster that had cracked like dry earth. Every step he took echoed faintly, as if the house itself were sighing at being disturbed. He passed from one room to another, taking in the broken remnants, a shattered chair leg in one corner, a rusted pot on a shelf, an old picture frame without glass lying face down against a wall. There was no comfort here, not yet. But Marcus had not come for comfort. He had come for absence, for the chance to stand somewhere that did not already hold his failures. And in that sense, the house was perfect. The isolation felt heavy, but it was also clean, untouched by the weight of expectations. He could rebuild this place as he wished, or simply let it stand as a hollow shelter. No one would come asking questions. No one would knock at his door in the night. Yet as he moved deeper into the rooms, something stirred within him. The soldier in him noticed details others might have overlooked. A scuff mark on the floorboards near the back door, fresher than the rest. The faint smell of something animal in the air, musky but not overwhelming. He paused, frowning slightly, listening. Silence. But silence was rarely as complete as it pretended to be. He could feel a presence, faint but undeniable, lingering at the edges of the house. He shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination. Too many years of hyper-awareness made him invent movement in shadows, shape in stillness. He was alone here, and that was the point. He returned to the front door, stepped out onto the porch again, and breathed in the cool air. Above the sagging roofline, the sky was heavy with low clouds, bruised purple and gray, promising more rain before nightfall. He would need to find a dry corner inside to sleep, maybe set up his cot in the room with the least broken floorboards. The wind carried a faint sound then, so soft it almost blended with the rustle of weeds. It was not the cry of a bird, nor the creak of wood. It was something else, a murmur of life too fragile to belong to the house. Marcus tilted his head, listening more closely, but the sound faded into the wind before he could place it. He rubbed the back of his neck and forced himself to turn away. The house was enough for today. The rest could wait. He retrieved his bag from the truck, slung it over his shoulder, and crossed the threshold once more, claiming the ruin as his own. Dust rose in faint clouds with every step, drifting through shafts of pale light that fell across the floor. He set his bag down in a corner of the main room and sat on it for a moment, letting the silence swallow him again. This was his place now, for better or worse. Outside, the trees whispered with the promise of another storm. Inside, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if it too waited to see what this new occupant would bring. Marcus stretched out his legs, leaned back against the wall, and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he was not surrounded by men with rifles or haunted by the echo of explosions. For the first time in years, he was simply a man in a house with nothing but silence for company. He told himself that was enough. He told himself it was all he wanted. But even as he sat there, the faint sound stirred again, rising from somewhere deeper in the house, too soft to ignore, too real to dismiss. Marcus opened his eyes, the gray light catching in them, sharp and cautious. The house was not as empty as the papers had promised. Something waited inside, and whether he liked it or not, his new life was not going to be built on solitude alone. The sound had haunted him through the night, surfacing in the moments when he tried to convince himself it was only his imagination. Each time he shifted on the cot he had dragged into the least ruined room, the faint noise returned, like the whisper of something small and fragile hidden away in the dark. It had come in pauses, not constant enough to be obvious, but never so faint that he could dismiss it as a trick of memory. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and broken, filled with restless turns and the vague sensation that he was not as alone in the house as he wanted to believe. By morning the rain had returned, thin at first, tapping against the windows like the soft ticking of a clock, then growing into steady sheets that blurred the world beyond the glass. Marcus sat up slowly, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. The air inside the house was damp and cool, filled with the faint scent of old plaster and the deeper, more immediate smell of something living. He rose from the cot and stood in the center of the room, listening. The wind moaned faintly through the cracks in the boards, but beneath it, there it was again, a low whimper, brief and uncertain, like a plea that barely had the strength to reach his ears. He followed it without hurry, each step measured, his boots creaking against the old wood. The sound guided him toward the back of the house. past a narrow hallway where the wallpaper had fallen away entirely, and the boards beneath his feet flexed dangerously with each shift of weight. The air grew colder the further he moved, and the smell sharpened. No longer just the mustiness of age, but the musk of an animal presence. He paused at a doorway, the frame sagging, its hinges rusted nearly solid. Beyond it, the room lay in shadow, the curtains torn and hanging like tattered flags. He took a breath, then pushed the door open. The noise swelled immediately, a faint chorus of whimpers, desperate yet hopeful. His eyes adjusted, and there in the far corner, half hidden beneath a collapsed shelf and a mound of old rags, lay the source. An adult German shepherd, her coat matted with dirt and damp, ribs visible beneath her skin, stared back at him with eyes that burned with both exhaustion and defiance. At her side, pressed close to her belly, were three tiny shapes, their fur still soft with youth, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. The puppies nosed blindly at her, letting out faint cries of hunger that cut through the silence more sharply than any storm outside. Marcus froze in the doorway. He had seen 100 kinds of desperation in his life, the kind that clung to people in war zones, the kind that hollowed out children in places too broken for rescue. But this was different. This was maternal instinct stretched thin to the edge of breaking, an animal that had given everything it had to protect what little life remained under its care. The dog's eyes stayed fixed on him, wary and unyielding. She did not rise too weak for that, but a low rumble vibrated in her chest, a warning that even at the edge of exhaustion, she would defend the small bodies huddled against her. He took a slow step forward, his voice silent, his hands held loosely at his sides. He did not speak, for words meant nothing here. What mattered was the calmness of his movements, the steadiness of his breath, the lack of threat in his posture. The dog's ears twitched, her body tense, but she did not lunge. She could not. Still, her gaze did not falter. The puppies whimpered again, and one of them wriggled forward, tumbling clumsily onto the cold floorboards before squeaking in protest. The mother nudged it back quickly with her nose, her sides heaving with the effort, and the sound she made then was not a growl but a plea, a note so raw that Marcus felt it sink deep into him. For a moment he considered leaving them there, telling himself it wasn't his problem, that he had bought the house to escape burdens, not to inherit new ones. But as he crouched lower, taking in the sharp angle of the dog's ribs and the thinness of her legs, he knew the truth. They would not last another week without help. The puppies were too small, too weak, and she herself was on the edge of collapse. This ruin of a house had been abandoned by people, but life had clung to it anyway, fragile and desperate, and now it had passed its judgment on to him. He rose and left the room, not in retreat but in decision. From his pack he took what little food he had carried with him, jerky, hard bread, and a small container of oatmeal. He softened the jerky in water, cutting it into small pieces with his pocket knife. When he returned to the room, the dog's ears perked, her body stiffening. He placed the food on a flat piece of wood and slid it slowly across the floor, stopping just short of her reach. She sniffed the air, uncertain, then lowered her head cautiously. At first she did not move, suspicion keeping her rooted, but hunger won. She leaned forward, teeth snapping the pieces up quickly, her eyes never leaving his. The puppies stirred at the smell, their small noses twitching, though they remained pressed against her for warmth. As she ate, Marcus felt something shift within him. He had come here to escape responsibility, yet here was responsibility waiting for him, alive and trembling. The soldier in him recognized the shape of the moment. In war, there were times when choice was stripped away, when survival demanded action without hesitation. This was not war, but the weight felt the same. If he turned away, he would be condemning them. And though he had walked away from many things in his life, something in those eyes told him he could not walk away from this. He left the food with her and stepped back, giving her space. Her growl softened, replaced by a silence that spoke of reluctant trust. The puppies squirmed again, their tiny paws scrabbling against the boards. One let out a sound barely more than a sigh, and the mother nudged it closer to her warmth. The scene was simple, almost ordinary, yet it struck Marcus harder than anything had in years. He realized that the house he had thought of as a shell for solitude had been holding a secret of its own, not an emptiness, but a fragile heartbeat waiting to be discovered. When he returned to his cot that night, the rain heavier than ever outside, Marcus lay awake listening not to the silence, but to the faint sounds of life stirring in the back room. Every whimper and shift seemed to echo in his chest, tugging against the part of him that had tried so long to remain closed. He knew tomorrow he would need to do more than offer scraps. He would need to bring water, find better food, and clear a space that was safe for them. He had thought this house would give him solitude, but instead it had given him a choice. And though he had come here running from the world had found him anyway, in the form of a starving shepherd and 3 tiny lives depending on her. The storm rattled the windows through the night, but inside the house something new had begun to stir, fragile yet undeniable. Marcus lay awake until dawn, knowing that the path he had chosen by stepping through that doorway would change everything that came after. The soldier had wanted escape, but the man had been given a family he never asked for. And whether he admitted it or not, he already knew he would not turn away. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a raw stillness that felt almost tender compared to the relentless pounding of the night before. The air was sharp with the scent of wet earth and pine needles, every surface glistening as though the world had been scrubbed clean. Marcus stood at the back door of the house with his arms crossed, gazing out into the yard where mist clung to the weeds and broken fence posts. He could hear the soft noises behind him, the faint scuffling of paws on warped floorboards, the occasional whimper of the puppies searching for warmth or milk. The German shepherd lay curled in the corner where he had found her, her body wrapped around the 3 small bundles of life that pressed against her for safety. Though she still eyed him with caution, there was no growl now, no flash of teeth. She was too tired for that, and perhaps, though he hardly dared to believe it, she had begun to understand he was not her enemy. He crouched down slowly, careful not to startle her, and slid a bowl of water closer. She sniffed at it suspiciously before lapping it up, her tongue moving quickly, desperate for more. When she had drained it nearly to the bottom, she lowered her head again, resting her chin on her paws. The puppies stirred and clambered over one another, their tiny cries filling the room. Marcus watched them with a heaviness in his chest that was at once painful and strangely relieving. It had been a long time since anything had demanded his care. In war, his choices had been about survival, about who lived and who died, but never about nurturing, never about sustaining life beyond his own or his comrades. This was different. It was not a duty assigned to him by command or law. It was a responsibility that had arrived unasked, and yet he felt it anchoring him to the present in a way nothing had in years. The food he had given the mother the night before had been only a start. He knew enough about animals to realize she needed better nutrition if she was to regain her strength, and the puppies would soon need more than just milk. He gathered his jacket and stepped out into the chill of morning. The nearest store was miles away, in the small town he had passed on his way in, and his truck's fuel gauge hovered lower than he liked. Still, there was no choice. He drove into town, the roads slick with rain, the pines bending gently in the breeze as if whispering their approval. The town was modest, its main street lined with weathered shops and faded signs, but it carried the kind of resilience that places like this often did. People waved absently at one another, dogs lounged on porches, and the smell of bread and coffee drifted faintly from the diner near the square. Marcus pulled up in front of the small grocery, its windows decorated with hand-painted lettering that promised fresh produce and supplies. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of flour, grain, and spices. The shopkeeper, a man in his 50s with sandy hair and a welcoming face, looked up from arranging a stack of canned goods. "Morning," he said with a nod. Marcus nodded back, offering no more than that, and set about collecting what he needed. A bag of kibble for adult dogs, powdered milk substitute for puppies, a few cans of meat, and even a box of biscuits he thought might serve as a small comfort. He added supplies for himself as well, coffee, beans, bread, and nails for the endless repairs that the house demanded. At the counter, the shopkeeper eyed the supplies, then Marcus. "Got dogs?" he asked casually. Something like that, Marcus answered, his voice quiet. The man gave a small smile but did not press further, and Marcus was grateful for that. He paid in cash and carried the bags back to the truck, feeling the weight of them not only in his arms but in the decision he had made. By buying the food, by spending what little he had on these animals, he had crossed a line within himself. He was not simply tolerating their presence, he was accepting them as his responsibility. When he returned to the house, the shepherd lifted her head at the sound of his boots on the porch, her ears pricking forward. She did not rise, but her gaze was intent, measuring. Marcus knelt near her corner and opened the bag of kibble, pouring a small portion into a bowl. The smell was enough to stir her, and she crept forward slightly, ribs shifting beneath her fur, to eat. The puppies mewled and nudged at her belly, some finding purchase, others too clumsy to latch on. Marcus tore open the packet of powdered milk, mixing it carefully with water in an old tin he found in the cupboard. He dipped a clean rag into the mixture and offered it to the smallest pup, who clamped onto it eagerly, tiny jaws working furiously. He felt the sharp tug of its mouth against the cloth, and a strange warmth surged through him. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm he had not expected. Each morning he woke not to silence, but to the soft cries of the puppies, to the shuffle of the shepherd moving slowly about the room, to the sounds of life that filled the house in a way no repair ever could. He cleared out the back room, sweeping the floor, patching the cracks in the walls with boards he scavenged from the collapsed shed outside. He dragged in old straw from the loft of the barn, spreading it into a dry bed, and laid down blankets from his pack to soften it. The mother dog watched him with wary eyes at first, but as the days passed, her suspicion softened. She no longer growled when he approached. Sometimes, when he sat quietly in the room, she even rested her head on her paws and closed her eyes, surrendering briefly to the safety he offered. The puppies grew stronger, their cries louder, their movements more confident. They tottered across the straw on unsteady legs, tumbling over one another in playful attempts at pouncing. Marcus found himself watching them more often than he meant to, feeling something uncoil inside him each time they stumbled into his boots or tried to gnaw at his laces. He spoke little, but his silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft breathing of animals that trusted him without condition. The house itself began to change under his hands. He patched holes in the roof, replaced broken boards on the porch, and cleared the yard of the worst of the weeds. Each repair was small, sometimes barely more than a temporary fix, but together they gave the place the faintest glimmer of life. At night, when the lantern flickered against the walls and the puppies slept curled beside their mother, Marcus sat in the corner and felt for the first time in years that he was building something rather than only surviving. It surprised him how quickly he began to think of the shepherd, not as an intruder, but as a companion. She followed him now when he stepped into the yard, her gait still uneven but growing stronger with each meal. She stayed close when strangers passed on the road, her ears pricked, her body positioned between Marcus and whatever threat might come. The puppies, too small to leave the yard, scrambled to the doorway each time he returned from town, their eyes bright with a joy that expected nothing in return. The soldier in Marcus had been trained to fight, to endure, to live with detachment. But here in this crumbling house with its patched walls and its straw-filled corner, he was discovering something altogether different. Responsibility had not come as a command, but as a gift hidden in the shadows of an abandoned room. Each nail he hammered, each board he set, each mouthful of food he offered to the dogs, stitched him more tightly into the fabric of a life he had thought no longer possible. And though he still woke some nights drenched in sweat, haunted by memories that refused to die, the sound of soft paws against the floor and the warmth of breathing bodies nearby anchored him to the present. The past could howl all it wanted, but the present now had its own voice, fragile yet insistent. It was the sound of puppies learning to bark, of a shepherd finding her strength again, of a man slowly, cautiously, allowing himself to believe that he could be more than the sum of his battles. By the time the first frost settled over the ground, glittering like silver in the morning light, the house no longer felt abandoned. It was not perfect, its walls still leaned, its windows still rattled, But it was alive, and so was he. In a way he had not been in years. The cold had settled in fully by the time the leaves turned brittle and began to scatter across the yard in gusts of wind. Frost glazed the edges of the weeds each morning, and mist clung to the ground until the sun finally burned it away. Inside the house, Marcus had established a rhythm that carried him from dawn to dusk. The German shepherd, whom he had begun to call Grace, though he never said the name aloud, grew stronger with each passing week, her coat thickening, her ribs no longer showing as sharply beneath her fur. The puppies, once fragile and stumbling, now tumbled across the floor with reckless energy, their yips and playful growls filling the house with a life it had not known in decades. Marcus often caught himself smiling as he worked, though the expression felt unfamiliar on his face. He had not thought himself capable of such lightness, but the animals had forced it upon him, leaving him no choice but to accept their joy. The repairs on the house continued, slow but steady. He patched sections of the roof that had threatened to collapse, reinforced the porch so it no longer groaned under his weight, and cleared the yard of broken boards and rotting debris. There was satisfaction in the work, in seeing a place once left for dead rise again, piece by piece. Yet even as the walls grew sturdier and the rooms more livable, Marcus felt a weight pressing against the fragile piece he was building. The world outside his patch of land had begun to take notice. At first it was harmless enough. Neighbors from the town, curious about the soldier who had bought the ruin for $500, stopped by on their way down the road. Some brought small gift spread, a jar of preserves, a bundle of firewood, gestures of goodwill that Marcus accepted with quiet gratitude. They asked questions, but he kept his answers short, careful not to reveal too much. What struck them most were the dogs. Children tugged at their parents' coats, eager to see the puppies, their faces lighting up when the clumsy little creatures bounded to the fence. The shepherd watched them carefully, never growling, but always placing herself between the strangers and her young. Marcus admired her for that, for the instinct that mirrored his own. But then came whispers. At the market, he caught the way two men spoke when they thought he could not hear, noting that the puppies looked like fine animals, purebred or close enough, the kind people might pay good money for if raised right. Another time, he overheard a passing remark outside the diner about how unusual it was that such dogs had been left in a ruin of a house. The tone carried curiosity, but also calculation, as though the speaker were already measuring the worth of what Marcus had stumbled upon. It was late one afternoon when the threat finally showed itself plainly. Marcus had been in the yard, hammering boards onto a section of broken fencing, when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A truck pulled up just beyond the gate, its paint chipped and its bed loaded with junk metal. Two men climbed out, both strangers. They walked with the easy swagger of men who thought themselves entitled, their boots sinking into the damp earth as they approached. Grace rose immediately from where she had been lying, her ears sharp, her body tense. The puppies, startled, scampered behind her, peering out with wide eyes. "You the one bought this place?" The taller of the two called out. He had a weathered face, his beard patchy, his eyes small and restless. Marcus straightened, setting the hammer down but keeping it close. "I am." "Hell of a bargain," the man said with a grin that did not reach his eyes. "Word in town is you found yourself some company here. Dogs, right? German shepherds?" Marcus said nothing, his silence answer enough. The second man, broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, spat into the dirt and stepped closer. "Fine animals," he said. "Be a shame if they went to waste on a place like this. Folks would pay good money for pups like that." Grace's growl rumbled low in her throat, steady and certain. Marcus felt the old instincts rise in him, the part of him that had been shaped by years of combat, that had stood on lines where danger was not suggested, but certain. He stepped forward, placing himself firmly between the men and the dogs. "They're not for sale," he said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. The taller man chuckled. "Everything's for sale, soldier. Question is just whether you want to make it easy or hard." The words were bait, meant to test him, but Marcus did not rise to them. He held their eyes with the unblinking calm of someone who had stared at worse threats in darker places. The silence stretched until finally the men shifted uneasily, muttering to one another as they turned back to the truck. But the message was clear. They had not come merely out of curiosity. They had come because they saw value, and they would be back if they thought the value was worth the risk. That night, Marcus sat by the stove, the lantern's glow soft against the patched walls. Grace lay at his feet, the puppies curled against her, their small bodies rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. He stared into the flames, his jaw tight. He had thought the hardest part of this life would be learning how to care for them, how to mend a house and build a routine from nothing. He had not expected to fight again, not like this. But the world had a way of testing every fragile thing he tried to protect. The days that followed were marked by vigilance. He reinforced the doors, repaired the locks, and added extra boards across the windows. When he worked in the yard, his eyes were always scanning the tree line, his ears tuned for the sound of an unfamiliar engine. He trained Grace in simple commands, her instincts sharpening quickly now that she was stronger, and he began working with the puppies, teaching them not just to play, but to listen, to come when called. Each lesson strengthened the bond between them, weaving threads of trust that made the house feel less like a ruin and more like a fortress. But the threat did not vanish. Once, while walking the property's edge, Marcus found boot prints in the mud that were not his own. Another time he spotted the glint of headlights parked on the road at dusk, lingering just long enough to be noticed before disappearing into the distance. Each sign deepened his resolve. He would not abandon this place, and he would not abandon the animals who had given him back a sense of purpose he had thought lost forever. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Grace beside him and the puppies tumbling over one another in the yard, Marcus felt the weight of it settle over him fully. This was his new battlefield. There were no orders, no commanding officers, no comrades at his side. There was only him, and the lives that now depended on him. The fight would not be measured in medals or victories. It would be measured in the simple act of keeping them safe, of holding back the world that wanted to take what little they had. The night deepened. The sky scattered with cold stars, and Marcus tightened his jacket around his shoulders. Grace shifted closer, her head resting against his leg, her warmth grounding him. He looked down at the puppies, their playful cries filling the air, and he knew with absolute certainty that whatever trials lay ahead, he would meet them. For the first time in years, he had something worth defending, and he would not let it be taken from him. The first real snow came late that year, drifting down in slow, deliberate flakes that blanketed the ground with a silence deeper than any storm. Marcus stood at the edge of the porch with his breath steaming in the cold air, watching the white cover soften the rough scars of the land. The weeds and broken fence posts vanished beneath it, the cracked earth smoothed into a flawless sheet. For a moment, the house itself looked less like a ruin and more like something quietly reborn, its patched roof and mended shutters softened by the weight of snow. Behind him, he could hear the patting of paws, the playful squeals of the puppies tumbling across the floorboards, their joy unbroken by the chill that seeped through the walls. Grace followed them closely, her gait strong now, her watchful eyes as steady as ever. She moved with the confidence of an animal who had survived hunger and fear and now stood rooted in safety. The threats had not disappeared entirely, but the weeks had passed without further confrontation. Marcus still caught the occasional glimpse of a truck parked too long on the road, or the echo of distant footsteps near the tree line, but no one had stepped forward again. Perhaps it was the presence of Grace, now formidable in her strength, or perhaps the intruders had sensed the quiet danger in Marcus himself. The way his stance spoke of readiness, of a man who had lived through battles and would not hesitate to protect what was his. Whatever the reason, the days had unfolded with a fragile calm, enough for Marcus to begin to believe that the life he was shaping here might endure. Each day became an act of building. He repaired the roof until it no longer leaked, replaced the broken window panes with salvaged glass from the shed, and painted the shutters with a coat of faded green he found in town. The porch no longer sagged dangerously beneath his boots, but stood firm, its boards freshly nailed, its railings straightened. The yard, once a tangle of weeds, began to take shape as he cleared space for a small garden. He tilled the soil with patient determination, imagining the rows of vegetables that might grow come spring. Every strike of the shovel into the earth felt like a promise a declaration that this place would no longer rot in abandonment. The animals grew with the house. The puppies, now sturdy on their legs, raced through the yard with bursts of wild energy, their coats thickening against the winter air, their eyes gleaming with mischief. They wrestled with one another in the snow, yipping and tumbling until they returned to Grace's side for warmth. She tolerated their antics with the calm of a mother who had fought too hard for their survival to begrudge their play. Marcus often stood watching them, his arms folded, a faint smile tugging at his mouth as he realized how completely they had claimed the yard, the house, and him. They were not possessions, not trophies to be shown off or sold. They were companions, each day binding themselves more deeply into the fragile structure of his heart. Evenings carried a rhythm of their own. Marcus lit the stove, filling the house with the scent of stew or beans, the simple meals that felt rich after the long work of the day. Grace would settle near the fire, the puppies piled against her, their soft breaths merging with the crackle of flames. Marcus sat at the table he had repaired from broken boards, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching the scene unfold with a quiet contentment that had once seemed impossible to him. The silence no longer pressed against him like a weight, but wrapped around him like a blanket, filled with the steady heartbeat of a life he had not known he was searching for. The townsfolk grew used to seeing him when he came in for supplies, his presence no longer the subject of curious whispers, but accepted as part of their world. Children sometimes asked about the puppies, and Marcus found himself promising that when they were older, some might be given to good homes nearby. He chose his words carefully, though, for he knew not all of them would leave. At least one would remain with him, perhaps more, for the thought of an empty yard and a silent porch was no longer something he could bear. The bond had been forged too deeply, etched into the fabric of his days. On a clear morning, when the snow shone blue under the rising sun, Marcus stood on the porch with the puppies bounding at his feet, their eager paws scattering powder into the air. Grace sat beside him, her body pressed against his leg, her eyes scanning the yard with the same vigilance he felt within himself. He looked out across the land, the fence now mended, the garden plot waiting beneath the frost, the house behind him whole in a way it had not been in decades. For the first time since he had returned from war, he felt not like a man in exile, but like a man home. He thought of the day he had first driven down the cracked road, of the ruin that had greeted him, of the emptiness he had expected to find inside. Instead, he had discovered life trembling in the shadows, a mother clinging to her young, a plea for help too raw to ignore. He had thought the house would give him solitude, but it had given him something far greater. It had given him a reason to rise each morning, a reason to fight again, not with bullets or orders, but with nails and wood, food and warmth, patience and care. The puppies tumbled over his boots, one tugging at his laces with tiny teeth, another leaping clumsily into the snow. Grace nudged them gently, her breath clouding in the cold, and Marcus reached down to rest a hand on her head. Her ears flicked back for a moment, then she leaned into his touch, the warmth of her body grounding him more surely than any memory ever could. He understood now that the house had never been about escape. It had been about finding something worth protecting, something that required him to give rather than withdraw. The battles he had fought overseas had been for duty, for survival, for reasons decided by others. But here, in this small patch of land with its broken boards and frost-covered soil, he had chosen his own battle, and in that choice, he had found not only responsibility, but healing. As the sun climbed higher, painting the snow with gold, Marcus let out a long breath that rose into the cold air like smoke. The world around him was still, the land quiet, the sky clear. Behind him lay the house that had cost $500 but had given him something beyond price. Around him bounded the puppies, alive with energy, their voices bright against the silence. Beside him stood Grace, steady and strong, her loyalty unquestioned. Together they formed a family not by blood or law, but by the simple, undeniable truth of shared survival and trust. Marcus smiled then, a small, unguarded smile that reached his eyes, and for the first time in years he felt certain of the road ahead. The soldier in him had fought his wars and carried his scars, but the man in him had found something greater, a home, a family, and a reason to stay. If this story kept you watching, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other stories waiting for you on this channel, each one more surprising than the last. And if this video struck a chord, share it with a friend. You never know who might need to hear it today.